Plus for the past.
All right, I think we will get started. Welcome everyone to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. My name is Sarah Yerkes. I'm a senior fellow here in the Middle East Program. And we are really delighted to welcome you here for what will be, I think, a very exciting two-part event, where first we'll start off part one with a fabulous panel, who I will introduce momentarily, followed by a conversation between Amr Hamzawy and Representative Joe Wilson, which should be really, really fascinating. And both of these are focused on this topic of regional security in the Middle East and North Africa. You know, this could not have come at a more, I think, interesting time, although times are interesting all the time, I think, in the Middle East. But we will certainly be talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, about Iran, about potential conflict there, about everything that has been happening of late. A couple of housekeeping issues. First of all, if you want to ask a question, you have a QR code on your seat if you are here with us in person. And for those of you online, you can enter your questions into the YouTube comments. Please feel free to put questions in at any time, and we will take those later on. And finally, I just want to highlight that this project, that this discussion today comes out of a new work stream that we're doing here in the Middle East Program at Carnegie that's focusing on regional security. It's led by my colleagues Amr and Fred, and there are some publications that are outside if you haven't had a chance to pick them up, and also available on our website. So with that, let me introduce our fabulous panel. We have really just four incredible experts with us to talk about different aspects of regional security. First, we have Karim Sadjapur, Senior Fellow in the Middle East Program here at Carnegie. We then have Mona Yacoubian, who is currently Senior Advisor and Director of the Middle East Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. Amr Hamzawy, the Director and Senior Fellow in the Middle East Program at Carnegie, and Fred Wehrey, also Senior Fellow in the Middle East Program at Carnegie. So we have pretty much the entire Middle East Program at Carnegie is up here right now. I'm actually going to jump off and start with you, Mona.
Okay.
And the question I wanted to ask you is it even possible to build security in the region without addressing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Or is the regional stalemate unavoidable as long as that conflict persists?
I mean, I think it's exceptionally difficult to do that. I think there has to be demonstrable progress toward a resolution. I think, you know, to be kind of clear-eyed about it, this is clearly going to take a long time after the terrorist attack on October 7th, and then the ensuing conflict in Gaza, even longer. We know that both populations, both Israeli and Palestinian, are in a sense further away from being open to cooperation and a two-state solution. So the road is going to be long, but it's really very, very difficult to imagine how the region can move ahead with respect to security and stability in the absence of concrete progress in shorthand Gaza. And the only comment else I'd make on this is, we've seen since October 7th and the ensuing conflict in Gaza, we've seen these flashpoints erupt all across the Middle East, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq to a lesser extent, the Houthis in the Red Sea, and of course even, and I'm sure Karim's going to talk about this, direct confrontation between Israel and Iran, a Rubicon essentially being crossed. So we should have no illusion that there can be regional stability in the absence of this long-standing conflict, at least moving more toward some sort of resolution.
Great, thank you. I want to turn to you next, Amr, to ask you if there are points of convergence between the regional powers. And here we're talking about Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Iran, Egypt, the UAE, and Qatar in regard to building security and preventing conflict.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and it's a pleasure to join the Middle East Program and Mona.
I'm honored, actually, to be included with you all.
We're honored to have you.
Yeah.
Yes. So let me start by saying I do agree with Mona's assessment that it's extremely difficult to see collective security arrangements emerging in the Middle East and North Africa without factoring in the significance of at least moving the parties engaged in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the direction of some sort of conflict resolution, some sort of even a negotiated temporary ceasefire arrangement that would ease tensions that have erupted in the region everywhere since October 7th, 2 years ago. We have seen how the different zones of tensions, instability, of military conflict have erupted in the region. And when we had a ceasefire arrangement in January of 25, they came to at least a brief moment of stabilization. The points of convergence between different regional actors and the big middle powers or the big regional actors are, as you've named them, Sarah, Saudi Arabia, the UAE and Qatar, Iran, Turkey, Egypt, Israel, of course. I believe for different purposes, all of them have an interest in regionalizing security, in no longer being dependent on what the US can offer in terms of its military presence, its diplomatic power, its push for negotiated settlements, especially because I believe as of now we do not know whether the US would like to invest diplomatically or militarily heavily in pushing the region in the direction of peaceful settlements of the different erupted conflicts. So that is a first point of convergence. A second point of convergence is, and I believe here most middle powers in the region, and I believe including Iran, but I would love to hear Karim's take on it, are operating based on a Israel-Palestine plus approach. I mean, questions of regional security are not only reduced to Israel and Palestine. That's one of the big takeaways of the last 2 years. When you look at Saudi diplomacy, at the UAE foreign policy, at Egypt's foreign policy, at Turkey, I mean, you look at Saudi Arabia and Turkey, and Syria plays a huge role for both of them. You look at Iran and maybe questions of their relations with different non-state actors across the region are as significant as the way they look at Palestine and Israel. And the same goes for Egypt, which is challenged not only in Gaza, but in Sudan and Libya and elsewhere. So I believe a second point of convergence is the Israel-Palestine plus approach to regional security.
Great, thank you. Speaking of Iran, I want to bring you in, Karim, to ask, first of all, in what ways has Iran tried to regionalize its security? But also a sort of separate question of the moment, which is how serious should we take this threat of Israel on Iran?
Thank you. It's great to be with all of you. I would first distinguish between the ideological objectives of the Islamic Republic of Iran and the national interests and security interests of the Iranian nation. So the ideological objectives of the Islamic Republic of Iran from 1979 to the present, it's evict America from the Middle East, replace Israel with Palestine, try to bring down the US-led world order. I don't think those reflect the national interests of Iran. National interests being that which advances the security and prosperity of your people. So really what this regime is thinking about are its ideological objectives, which obviously are not, it's security, but it's more about regime survival, right? And so it's been said about Russia that Russia seeks security and the insecurity of its neighbors. And I think that very much applies to Iran as well. If you look at the 5 places that Iran was dominating up until about 6 months ago, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, Gaza, all failing states. So Iran thrives in atmospheres of profound insecurity, weak governments. They've proven very effective at filling power vacuums. These are power vacuums which, we created some of them, like the Iraq War, the Arab uprisings of 2011 created others. And I think that Iran is still very much committed to that strategy, even though they've suffered some serious blows over the last couple of months. I think the intent is still there, although the capacity has been diminished. In terms of the moment we're in right now, I think I was telling Sarah or Fred earlier that over the last couple months, the public discussion about Iran and these nuclear negotiations, it kind of veers from hopes of an imminent deal to fears of an imminent attack. And it just kind of is like a pendulum which goes back and forth. I've never thought a deal was going to be imminent. If you recall, it took the Obama administration about 3 years to negotiate JPOA and then JCPOA. And I also think just based on the president's public statements that, he's made very clear that he's not interested in getting involved in another conflict in the Middle East, and he wants to resolve this issue diplomatically. Frankly, I think if it were up to President Trump, he would love a Nixon to China moment with Iran. He would love to go to Tehran and normalize relations. That's not going to happen because the Iranians are not amenable to that. But I'm not, let me put it this way, I don't think the likelihood of a comprehensive deal is high. And I think that both Tehran and Washington want to avoid conflict. And I think the most likely outcome in the coming months, in my view, is similar to what we saw with the JPOA, the precursor to the JCPOA, which is kind of a limited interim deal, which never becomes comprehensive.
Thank you. And then finally, Fred, I wanted to bring you in to look a bit at the U.S. perspective and what benefit would regionalizing security in the region bring from a U.S. interest perspective, and how much of these different arrangements we've been talking about are due to the U.S. withdrawal from the Middle East space?
Yeah, well, I think it would benefit the U.S., and I think the U.S. really has no choice but to accept this regionalization of security. I mean, this trend of local agency, of local states taking matters into their own hands has been going on for quite some time. We can talk about its roots in the pandemic and then, doubts about U.S. commitment. But the fact of the matter is, there's a new center of gravity emerging in the region. It's more multipolar, it's more multi-aligned. You have smaller middle states engaging in détente, ceasefires, mediation. And so, the U.S. has to accept that. It also has to accept some degree of internationalization of security and the fact that the region is becoming more multi-aligned. The U.S. is still dominant in certain spheres, but it's no longer maintains exclusivity over certain, spheres of influence. I think all of this is a benefit. Look, the U.S. has been trying to pivot away from this region for so long in terms of reallocating material resources, military resources, policy bandwidth to other, priorities, getting its troops out of harm's way, while still preserving some, access and influence. And it wants to spur local states to own more of their security. So I think all these trends are for the good. However, I want to add some caveats. The U.S., should be asking itself, what kind of stability and peace is being delivered by these deals? Is it an enduring peace that really gets at the roots of the conflict? Because the region's history is replete with, bargains and deals that simply reconfigure conflicts, right? They don't address the root causes. And so, peace with justice. We shouldn't conflate, reconstruction or recovery with enduring peace settlements, right? And I think this is the thing we really need to scrutinize. And here I'm talking about the issue of displaced persons, refugees, and sort of revanchist settlements that we see across the region. I think we also have to keep in mind that the architects of this new regional order, the states that are engaging in this peacemaking, are deeply problematic in some ways. I mean, they're authoritarian, they have problems at home with their own governance, and so there's also an issue where a state can play a positive role in one conflict and be pouring gasoline on the fire in another one, and we've seen that as well, and so we shouldn't ignore that with certain players in the region. The last thing I'll close on is, how do we institutionalize these deals, right? And so, as Amr said, the region has lacked a formal security structure like the OSCE. There's been various, multiple attempts at doing this, but each one of these initiatives is often owned by one state in the region and it's used for a specific purpose. So there's not really an inclusive structure that includes all the countries in the region. And so, what role can the U.S. play in nudging that along? Should we play a role? And the last thing I'll end on is how do we address some of these non-traditional challenges? Obviously we need to focus on stopping shooting wars, right? Ending hostilities. But the region's real roots of instability often reside within states. They're transnational challenges, climate change, corruption, authoritarianism, all these things that are so hard to address with sort of bargains and deals.
Thank you. I think you bring up a couple of really important points that I want to pick up on and have others come in. And one is about this idea of lasting and enduring peace. And, I want to have you all, offer your thoughts. Feel free to reflect on other things that were said as well. But, how likely are these type of new arrangements to provide the sort of lasting, enduring peace that Fred is talking about. And then what do you think is the U.S. role? I mean, should the U.S. be pushing for this, standing back, staying out of the way? I mean, what are some responses? Maybe we'll start with you, Kareem.
Sure. I'm assuming you're talking about the Abraham Accords, among other things.
Well, that's one of them, yeah. I mean, the notion that was sort of seen as a lodestar of what's going to solve all the problems,
Yeah.
and certain things were attached with it. And the other thing is, it's also sort of bled into an effort to keep China out of the region. So, you know, the degree to which the U.S. attaches things to these sort of local deals.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to reveal my biases here. And I remember when I first came to D.C. As a graduate student, it was on the eve of the Iraq War. And there was a debate about whether the road to peace in the Middle East went through Baghdad or Jerusalem. You probably remember this. Like, what is the most important thing to do to bring peace and stability to the Middle East? Is it to remove Saddam Hussein from power or resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? In my view, if you could only have, if you only have one arrow to use, and you have to pick one big problem to try to resolve to bring stability to this region, it's my view that we're never going to have lasting stability in the Middle East so long as you have a government in Iran whose organizing principle is revolutionary ideology of 1979 rather than the national interests of its people. And so I'm sure others would disagree with that, but Iran is a very big, powerful, wealthy country, and as long as they spend their enormous resources funding proxies that are thrive in instability, a strong Lebanese government is inimical to the interests of Hezbollah. A functional Palestinian government is inimical to the interests of Palestinian Islamic Jihad. A functional, strong Iraqi government is inimical to the interests of the Shia militias in Iraq. I'm skeptical that, so in some ways I'm agreeing with you, Fred, that when the news of the Abraham Accords came about, I thought, that's fine, but the idea that this now transforms the region is going to bring peace and stability, I was always skeptical. And let me emphasize one thing, which is, I'm not talking about Iran's transition to Denmark, right, to become Norway or Denmark. I'm just talking about a transition to a government whose organizing principle is the interests of the nation, not revolutionary ideology. That could be under, it doesn't have to necessarily be under a representative government.
Thank you. Mona, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I think a few things come to mind. One, I'm going to sort of contradict myself in terms of where I started, which is, yes, significant progress toward resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in my view, is a sine qua non for the region to really integrate security-wise and find stability. Similarly, by the way, with Iran as well. And I do want to push back on one thing you said initially, Kareem. But so therefore, I think in a way we have to lower our sights a bit. And I think if we put out there enduring peace as the goal, we're not going to go very far here. So I think we have to talk about baby steps. We have to talk about de-escalation and stabilization. And there, I think there are enormous opportunities. And I really want to pull on what both Amr and Fred said, because I strongly agree that, in my view, we are at a hinge moment in the region. We're at a point where the order that had pertained, 20 years ago is really vanishing, if not vanished entirely. And there's a new order emerging. And that new order, I think, is characterized by a much greater degree of regional agency to drive these changes, to drive problem solving. And in that regard, and I think the region, and I would include Iran in this, is interested in de-escalating tension. And we could have a little back and forth on that. But you see the rapprochement, for example, between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Yeah. In the Gulf, I think they are.
Yeah, they are, which was not the case, by the way, back in 2015, where the Gulf was deeply opposed to this. So the region is owning much more. And for that, I'm actually optimistic, because I think that therefore there's this organic drive from within the region to start to solve the problems. The US may not always be open to it, but I think we don't have a choice. And I'm not sure we are interested. I mean, we've been trying desperately, the US, to pivot, right? For administration upon administration. Well, the pivot is now perhaps being forced upon us, or it's happening. What I think is critical, though, is that the US and others help shape and catalyze some of these shifts. Certainly as an American, in a way that redounds to US national security interests, but also in a way that actually anchors stability. So in particular, I'd say let's look at stabilization prospects in Lebanon and in Syria. Both countries are really, in my view, are on the stand at the threshold of unparalleled opportunity to stabilize and get onto trajectories that move those countries both towards stability and reform. At the same time, the challenges are enormous in both places, and there are spoilers all around waiting to take advantage of missteps. This is where I think the U.S. and the international community needs to play a really important role in how those stabilization processes move forward, acknowledging that we're not going to be the ones putting the money on the table. This is not Iraq redux. This is going to be really funded by the Gulf and others. So I think the region is really at this incredible crossroads that could lead toward greater stability, de-escalated tensions, if managed well. If not, I think we can easily see falling back into conflict in several places that right now are in a slightly more de-escalated spot.
Thank you. Amr.
Thank you, Sarah. Let me start by adding a couple of points to the imminent risks I see in the current geostrategic environment in the Middle East and North Africa. One, I believe, and it really all goes back to the lessons and the impacts, lessons we've been learning, states, actors in the region have been learning from the last 2 years, a bit more than 2 years since October 7, 2023, as well as the impacts of the ongoing conflict in the region. One, clearly, we are witnessing a geostrategic environment in which we have an unprecedented asymmetry of power between state actors, and this needs to be factored in. And it's not only about Israel on the one hand and Iran on the other hand, it's about state actors in the region and the emerging asymmetry of power, military power, and its impacts. Secondly, I see multiple signs of an arms race unfolding in the region, very similar to what we had before in the 1950s and 1960s and a bit in the 1970s. And when you put it in a historical context, this is an extremely worrying sign. A third risk, which I see emerging or continues to be relevant geostrategically, not emerging now, is the ongoing duality of state and non-state actors. This is one of the very few regions in today's world where foreign policy is not only made by state actors, it's made by non-state actors as well. Hezbollah in Lebanon has for a very long time made foreign policy for Lebanon. Hamas, other groups in Palestine, have for a very long time made foreign policy for the Palestinian people. And the same goes for Iraqi militias and the Houthis in Yemen and so on and so forth. So these risks should not be ignored, and they need to be looked at in line of the impacts of the last 2 years. I believe state actors in the region, especially the middle powers, and I would include Iran, by the way, in this assessment, have come to learn that ongoing escalation at the end of the day harms their interests. I believe Iran, I stand to be corrected, of course, and Karim is the expert on Iran. It's very difficult for me to see Iran's foreign policy now as being identical to Iran's foreign policy toward the Middle East prior to October 7, 2023. I see signs of rapprochement with the Gulf, but I see also signs with rapprochement with Egypt, with Jordan, and elsewhere. A degree of de-escalation, a push for de-escalation that's happening regionally in Iran's foreign policy behavior in the region. Did it happen before October 7, 2023? I believe it was not the case. There was a one-off agreement which was relevant between the Saudis and the Iranians. So I believe state actors in the region are reading the signs and the impacts as pushing them to regionalize security, not to be dependent on what the US can offer or what China can offer in competition with the US, but to regionalize security. They realize the risks and ongoing imminent dangers of an arms race, of state, non-state actors, dualities, and so on and so forth. And finally, there are even some initial moves to figure out a diplomatic framework, which is here not Israel-Palestine plus, it's Arab League plus, where there are some attempts to figure out a way of setting forward a diplomatic framework for negotiations. I'm not sure how successful it's going to be, given Fred's excellent point on the history, on the track record, which has been negative with regard to collective security efforts. But maybe this needs to be looked at. All of it, to go back to Mona's point, that I am hopeful as well. The region is at a crossroads. And it's definitely not going to happen away from regional agency. So we have to take regional agency very seriously.
Thank you. Fred, did you want to respond to anything that was said?
Yeah, I mean, just to go back to the sort of role of the U.S. and other outside, powers, I think as we've seen, the de-escalation is emerging organically, and it should. And these peace deals, it's great the region is taking them on. I do think, outside states can play a role in guaranteeing the settlements, in Amr, your paper where you identified the end of the Iran-Iraq war and the TAF agreement. Those were both made possible by outside, agreements and support. And I think that's a critical role for outside states to play. I would also say when we're talking about, stabilization, and I agree we shouldn't set our sights too high, but at the same time, I think there's a history in this region where we've been in a stabilization mode for so long. We've been in a transition period in Libya, right? And so we shouldn't deceive ourselves that just because it's relatively stable doesn't mean there's real problems of justice and inequity and that these things can blow up at any time. And so how do you build inclusive institutions? How do you build the rule of law? That's not simply a question of funding from the Gulf. And so I think handing the sort of reconstruction and stabilization piece over to the states with deep pockets and the oil wealth, I don't think that's necessarily going to get us there. And I do think, again, the U.S. comes under so much criticism for what it's done and its nation building and its behavior in the region. But I do think we had certain capabilities with USAID, the Office of Transition Initiatives, the Conflict and Stabilization Bureau. We had the know-how to insert ourselves into these post-conflict scenarios and move the ball forward. And unfortunately, that capability is now gone. And I think that's one of your questions is what's the impact of our aid cuts on this whole environment?
Yeah. Sorry, Mona, and then Kareem.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in. So I want to clarify that I certainly don't think that handing over wholesale the stabilization process to deep-pocketed Gulf actors is a smart way to go. In fact, what I hope I was clearly said was, no, in fact, it's essential that the decades of experience, however successful or not, and I think there is a certain degree of humility on the part of the U.S. that's demanded, if we look at certainly Afghanistan and even Iraq. But yes, indeed, it is essential that stabilization efforts in places like Lebanon and Syria move forward with the best practices in mind, issues around inclusive governance, issues around accountability, the rule of law. These are countries, particularly Syria, whose social fabric has been utterly torn apart. And so the role of transitional justice, but also reconciliation, how to balance that. There's so much. And in fact, just to say one last point, the timing of this in terms of where the U.S. is couldn't be worse.
Right.
With the dismantling of USAID, having worked there myself for a few years, and frankly, even before that, with the dramatic decline in U.S. foreign assistance dollars. This is exactly the moment for that level of expertise to be called upon to help guide these very important, and I would say, I'm optimistic that these processes can land well, but the challenges are enormous. So I think that the challenge ahead is to think about how, in fact, to sort of catalyze and consolidate that expertise. Just because USAID has been dismantled does not mean that expertise is gone. On the contrary, there are scores of incredibly seasoned professionals who have a lot to bring to the table. So we have to start thinking about a new model. What's the new model for how to engage on issues around stabilization in particular, and how to sort of how to plug in this expertise where it exists in a new and different way.
Kareem and then Amr.
Sure.
I love this debate. This is
Yeah,
so fabulous.
I think I have a couple points of debate, which is, Jeff Bezos has said that his leadership philosophy at Amazon as CEO, he says, I'm inflexible on vision, but flexible on details. That essentially describes Ayatollah Khamenei's leadership philosophy as well. He's shown himself to be inflexible on vision. The vision, death to America, death to Israel, kicking America, trying to defeat the US-led world order. The details, you do normalization with Egypt or Jordan, those, in my view, are not principles, but they're details, and he's willing to be compromised on them. But you're right, Mona, that in the Gulf, there's been a détente between Iran and the Gulf countries. But it's never wise to make predictions about the Middle East. I would predict that Iran is going to do everything it can to sabotage Lebanon and Syria's ability to transition to a stable, prosperous post-Iran order. And, I spent a year as a Fulbright scholar in Beirut many years ago. My big takeaway from that year is it takes decades to build something and it takes days and weeks to destroy it. They're very effective at sabotage and destroying things. So whether it's carrying out a bunch of assassination campaigns of individuals, trying to kill Ahmed al-Shara, if they see, which is I think they do see right now, a post-Iran order, Hezbollah disarming, Syria being hostile to Iran, inimical to their interests, they're very effective at sabotaging. And if you talk to Gulf countries, the leadership, they won't tell you that their views and concerns about Iran have changed. They haven't changed. But I think they realize that, if you're MBS and you're going to take a decade to go and try to build NEOM and you pour $1 trillion into it and Iran can come by in an afternoon and destroy it or sabotage it with rockets, missiles, and drones, you want to deconflict. So, but if there's an attack on their nuclear facilities, I think there's a decent likelihood that they're going to retaliate against in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. So I think that this pessimism I just laid out, I think will remain as long as this supreme leader is in power, which is not going to be forever. He's 85 years old, but I've never seen signs that he's shown himself capable of change and reforming his worldview.
Thank you. Amr.
Thank you, Sarah. I believe there are two approaches to the current geostrategic environment in the region. One is more of sort of a macro approach where we would be expecting sort of a lasting, stable agreement and settlements of all conflicts around, where we would wake up to find a solution for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, find Iran behaving regionally in a sustained fashion in a fundamentally different way than what Iran has been doing in the last decades, and finding zones of instability and military conflict and civil strife in Libya and Sudan and Yemen figured out. I mean, this is not going to happen. I believe what we need to focus on and look at and see what agents on the ground are doing is with regard to the baby steps you were referring to, Mona, or piecemeal temporary settlements that would put the region in a way better place than where we are right now and where we have been, especially in the last 2 years. So finding some rapprochement and détente in the Gulf is positive, not only from a Gulf security perspective, but for the peninsula in general, and it helped definitely in the last 2 years stabilize the situation in Yemen, which is still facing a very difficult humanitarian situation, but at least the bloodshed we were seeing before the Chinese-mediated agreement between the Saudis and the Iranians to restore diplomatic relations is no longer happening. When I look at developments in Lebanon, yes, baby steps, but encouraging. When I look at developments in Syria, and I believe Syria is a question which needs to be looked at domestically, not only regionally, and my doubts are about the capacity of the current government, those who are in charge, to figure out a way of creating a momentum for national reconciliation, for inclusion, for representation. These are the challenges, not only whether we have enough regional actors in support or regional actors like Iran trying to maybe undermine. When I look at the situation in Libya, and Fred, of course, knows way more, the stalemate in Libya and its impacts, what does it take to figure out baby steps to move forward? So these are two fundamentally different approaches. I believe if we take regional agency seriously, we need to look at the details of what's happening, not put a broad brush on a picture, which continues to be problematic. This is a region where we have per capita the most displaced, the highest number of displaced people as of now, where we have been seeing ongoing bloodshed and military conflicts throughout the last years and instability since almost a decade and a half. So and where long-standing crises with regard to the social fabric, with regard to the polity in each one of the countries, including the Gulf with the deep pockets, continue to persist. However, the argument that could be put forward right now is in defense of baby steps that can be guaranteed by international actors. So exactly as Fred was mentioning, the US role or the European role is not to initiate, but to come in and help in stabilizing piecemeal agreements that are unfolding on the ground. How to do that, with what mechanism, with what kind of diplomatic framework, what can we learn in the region from comparative experiences in Europe or elsewhere, what can we draw on to develop collective arrangements? Once again, Arab League Plus is the real challenge.
Thank you. I want to just remind everyone, if you have questions, please use the QR code, or if you're online, use YouTube comments. We'll turn to those in just a minute. I did want to bring in Russia and China. We talked a little bit about China, but I'd love to hear from all of you a bit more about how you see Russia and China fitting into this picture that we've been painting so far. Maybe, Karim, I'll start with you.
Sure. Russia and China are always lumped together as like a unitary actor, and I think they have totally divergent interests in the Middle East. China wants to see regional stability and the free flow of energy, free flow of oil from the region. I would argue Russia benefits from the opposite. They benefit from instability, high-risk premiums of oil and gas. So even though they're commonly lumped together, I think they have very different interests. And I actually believe that America and China have more common interests in the Middle East than China and Russia do.
Interesting, yeah, Mona.
Yeah, I agree, and I guess I would maybe pull a little bit on the Russia thread for a moment. I think Russia has, however they may like to try to frame it, taken a pretty significant hit with the fall of the Assad regime. This was a primary platform for Russia to project its power and influence. That said, they're incredibly pragmatic, and they continue to find ways to the extent possible, operate with Shara to try to maintain some kind of military presence. And of course, we've also seen that they have quite a presence in the Gulf, in the Emirates in particular. I think what's interesting for me is to sort of step back and understand, again, we're in a multipolar world. And the Middle East is not isolated or insulated from all of the other things happening in the world. And what's fascinating is to really trace the impacts of the Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the ways in which the Russians, I think, took quite a hit that emanated into the Middle East. And in particular, and I'd really be interested in Karim's thoughts on this, the dynamics between Russia and Iran, where again, in Syria, we saw initially that Russia was the senior partner and Iran was sort of more kind of coming along. That power dynamic shifted. I don't know what it means going forward for the Middle East. This deepening relationship between Russia and Iran, the provision of drones, drone technology, even the setting up of a drone factory. What should we understand about that going forward? And also, what's Russia's position on Iran perhaps gaining a nuclear capability? In the past, they were the Russians were with us in the JCPOA. In this kind of more unstable multipolar world, we're not seeing that. Where that's going to go, I don't know.
Let me have you respond actually to the points on Iran and then move on the panel.
Yeah, before I forget, this is pertinent to what you were raising. A friend of mine spent a few hours with Ahmed al-Shara a couple months ago, and he said that Shara had just had a long chat with Putin before their meeting. And he said, Putin basically said to him, listen, all of your weapons for the last decades have come from us, and the Americans are not going to sell you weapons. So it's in your interest to keep the Russian bases in Syria and keep your weapon systems, because we're the ones who are going to need to resupply you. It's not in your interest to sever this relationship. Reminded me of that old adage from Kissinger that diplomacy is telling other people what their interests are. So the thing about Putin is that when you speak to leaders, and especially in the Gulf, it's very surprising how they say Putin is their friend. They're okay dealing with him. I suspect it's true about Sisi as well, Amr. So the Iranian support for the drone support for Ukraine. I don't know if Russia will share with them. They will probably continue to share with them missile defense systems that can deter Israeli attacks and things like that. But offensive weaponry, which they use against Gulf countries, I'm skeptical of that. And then you touched on the big question, which is, has Putin's disposition about Iran having a nuclear weapon changed? And I think he benefits from, in some ways, the status quo. Iran not having a weapon, but continuing to be a source of tension, a thorn in the side of the United States. This tension, which risks brings the price of oil higher. This is the sweet spot he likes. I don't think he wants this issue. He doesn't want Iran to get a bomb, but nor does he want this issue to be totally resolved.
Makes sense.
Amr.
Yes, I mean the research work which Fred and I and other colleagues in the program have been doing has actually been pushing for a paradigm shift, which is not to look at what the US is doing or what China is doing or what Russia is doing, but to actually look at what regional actors perceive as being US priorities, interests, and policies, or Russian priorities, interests, and policies, and the same for China, and to see how they interact with it. So if I am to stay true to this perspective with a focus on China, I believe regional middle powers look at China as being able to do a grand offering similar to what the US can offer. That's the one key difference between how they see China and how they see Russia. Russia is interesting from a military arms sale perspective, not from a military deployment, but from an arms sale perspective primarily. China is interesting from an arms sale perspective. China is building a base in the Horn of Africa. China is present in different ways, trade, technology, FDIs. So the one great power that can do a comparable grand offering to what the US has been providing the region is China. That's one. Secondly, do middle powers in the region, and I'm not including Iran, I'm now focused on the Arab middle powers in the Gulf or Egypt, or even I would stretch the argument to Algeria. If they have a choice between a grand offering coming from the US and a grand offering coming to the same conditions from China, which one would they pick? I would say that they would still pick the grand offering coming from the US for different purposes and reasons, including the history, the accumulated history of security arrangements and diplomatic presence, and the roles which the US had played. The more the US retreats, the more attractive the China grand offer becomes. Last point, on China, I believe it's important to see behavior of great powers from a regional perspective in moments of crises and wars. In the last 2 years, the one great power which has been on the ground trying to diplomatically solve, trying to militarily initiate has been the US. China has been missing. Even at the southern entry point of the Red Sea, where China's trade with the world has been impacted in a fundamental fashion, China continued to free ride on the US security role. So I believe it's important, Sarah, to shift the lens, to take regional actors first and see how they perceive and interact with great power policies.
Thank you, Fred.
Yeah, my colleagues really hit it. So I don't know how much I have left to say. But yeah, again, I think the theme of our analysis has been, don't overinflate the threat from these, powers. And certainly they are on the scene in different ways. And, I wouldn't consider either one a peer competitor. I think, Russia's more of a disruptor. They've been very pragmatic, opportunistic in places like Libya, Sudan, Syria, on the arms sales scene. I do think their regional image took a real hit with the fall of Assad, because states are looking at that saying the Russians aren't going to be in your corner, right? And so I think China is, very significant on the trading front. I think states in the region are, pursuing what's called a hybridized approach to their security, where they're going to the U.S. for external security and the Chinese for internal security. And we've seen that with a lot of the technology, for internal surveillance. Look, I mean, we've said that the U.S. has to accept the presence of these powers. The question is, where are we going to draw the red lines? Where do we perceive that our vital interests are at stake in pushing back against some of their, encroachment? But we've been in meetings at various agencies where these questions are still being, worked out. And just to echo Amr's point and conclude, we have to accept that regional states have the agency here, right? It's not like they're passive pawns on a chessboard, right? They're the ones often calling the shots, inviting this power in. I mean, the Saudi-Iran deal was sort of gifted, right, to China, right? And so this, I think we have to accept that. The last thing I'll talk about is the public opinion piece of it. It's fascinating and disconcerting that China is pulling ahead on the public opinion polls, and we have to say is that because of China's virtues on certain fronts, but also because of hostility, rightly so, against U.S. policies in the region.
Great, thank you. I want to bring in some of the audience questions, and one of them is directed to you, Mona, but I invite everyone to answer it, which is that, it says, Mona, you spoke about the specialists that were laid off from USAID and state still being available. If they have no official capacity, how should their expertise be well used and by whom? And I want to add on to that to sort of broaden it to just more broadly, what is the impact of the aid cuts and sort of what does this mean for the public opinion question that Fred was just talking about? So I'll have you start, Mona, and then.
Sure. I mean, to answer your question first, I mean, the impact, I think, is enormous in terms of the hit that U.S. soft power has taken in the region. The really critical and important role that USAID in particular has played across the Middle East and North Africa. It is often, in a region that is plagued by, and often the U.S. is presented in a bad light or seen in a bad light. There's USAID coming with humanitarian assistance and projects and so forth from the American people. And I really think you can't, one shouldn't underestimate just how powerful that is. So to the question, let's be clear. Just because the government affiliation goes away, the skill set remains. And it's a critical skill set. And in my view, I think what needs to happen is there needs to be a better way to connect that skill set with the funding that is emanating from the Gulf. What that looks like, not clear. I'll make a plug for the Middle East program at CSIS. This is something I hope that we'll be able to work on. We want to lift up and have a pillar devoted to stabilization efforts in Lebanon and Syria in particular, the Levant stabilization pillar, and we want to sort of look exactly at these questions of, there are multiple stakeholders out there, and no one's fully owning any of this. So how do we bring together folks in a hub, in an initiative that at a minimum, there's sharing of best practices, but also you have, Gulf countries looking for, okay, well, what USAID projects have been defunded? What should we be picking up? I mean, I think this is a new way that we're going to all need to be working. It's just starting. But I think we should not at all kid ourselves that just because somebody might lose their U.S. government affiliation, that depth of knowledge and experience carries with them.
Thank you. Fred, did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I would agree with Mona. I just think the cuts are going to be felt, years from now, and I think we're going to regret them. And I want to circle back to one of Kareem's points about Iran's entry into the Arab world in fractured societies and the way it, creates militias or supports militias. I mean, one of the best ways the U.S. had in my view, of countering that in terms of rebuilding security sectors was not through traditional conventional military assistance, but through the sorts of skills that USAID had, where you're talking about security sector reform and dealing with militias as a whole of government problem, where you're talking about the economic, the social roots, and these sorts of. I'm not saying we did it well all the time, but it was a tool, and we had the knowledge base of people who understood how to operate in these fractured environments that a lot of times traditional diplomats didn't know. And so that is also a counter to Iran's influence. Iran is very capable of operating in these fractured societies. And unfortunately, I think we're basically abdicating. We're pulling back in terms of the personnel cuts. You could argue also on the counter-extremism front, right? I mean, who knows what's going to happen now that there isn't USAID aid going into certain camps, and we'll see the effects years from now.
Amr, did you want to come in on this?
Well, maybe only to say that it's been disheartening in the last weeks to attend meetings and to see many attendees with signs having their names on former USAID, and then to listen to their expertise manifested in their comments on different issues. We had an excellent private discussion here at Carnegie on Sudan, and we benefited a lot from the expertise of former USAID experts. So it's disheartening, and I hope it gets addressed. I'm not sure how, but I hope it gets addressed.
Kareem.
Well, I think one of the greatest investments America's ever made in the Middle East has been American University of Beirut, probably American University of Cairo as well. The return we've gotten on that has been phenomenal, and I think that that institution is facing major challenges as a result of these cuts. I would add to USAID, Voice of America. Voice of America was very impactful in Iran. It had the ability to reach 40 million Iranians who are either reliant on state television or BBC Persian or Iran International. It had issues, it had challenges, it needed to be reformed, but the regime felt very strongly about that. And so for Trump to just unilaterally shut it down, at least get some concessions in return if you're going to shut that down. So I think Fred is right that the impact of these things will be weighed in years.
Another audience question, in terms of a regionalized security arrangement or agreement, what role do you see for the GCC or the Arab League? Should a new arrangement build on these existing entities or be completely separate? Maybe Amr, I'll ask you to start.
Sure. Thank you, Sarah. Let me now refer to the excellent research work which our junior fellow Natalie Trish has been doing in the last month on examining how effective or how less effective or how ineffective collective arrangements emanating out of the Arab League have been in general. And the track record has been, since the creation of the Arab League, that collective security arrangements that have been pushed forward within the Arab League have been, in general, ineffective. If they have been effective, it's been for a short while, and it didn't last, they have not lasted for a long time. The effective collective security arrangements we had in the region were regional agents inspired or initiated or mediated, but backed by international guarantees from primarily the US. So if I take the track record seriously, Sarah, the response would be that regional actors, primarily states, have to sit down and figure out ways of resolving conflicts, but not in a holistic approach. I believe this is not going to take us anywhere, but by actually dismantling, breaking down the different zones of instability, of wars, of civil strife, of military confrontation, and trying to get to some progress in some of them, or at least in one of them, in a regional context that is all-inclusive. This has to be, once again, Arab League plus. It cannot continue to be by elimination of non-Arab actors in the Middle East, Iran, Turkey, and Israel. They have to be factored in. And secondly, some workable agreements with regard to guarantees, with regard to some backup plans in case the respective arrangement falls apart, will have to be pushed forward and promoted by the US, maybe by the Europeans. If the US and China can work maybe in the Gulf or with regard to Yemen or with regard to other places in the region, that would be great. But the track record is regional agents take the lead, and they then need for their collective arrangements some international backing.
Great, thank you. Do you want to come in, Karim?
Well, it's tangential to what Amr said and what Mona's talked about, which is a topic we haven't really touched on today, and you could do a whole other panel on it, but that is to what extent, when we're thinking about our own aid or working with Gulf countries to offer aid, is it still going to be tied to conduct of these governments, whether it's human rights metrics, democracy metrics? It seems like that certainly, President Trump in his speech in Riyadh, the biggest applause line he got was when he basically said nation builders who destroyed more nations than they built, and regime changers who knew nothing about their societies. That is the ascendant view in the Republican Party, and I think probably among many Democrats they would say, well, we need a humble foreign policy and not. So that is, for me, a big question, whether it's Egypt or Syria. Are we going to ask Ahmed al-Shara for certain metrics with regards to treatment of women and religious minorities? Or some in the administration argue that's necessary. Others say no, we should just remove the sanctions in a blanket way. But I think that's one of the big challenges and debates we're going to be grappling with in the coming years.
Thank you. Mona, do you want to?
I mean, just a quick word. One, I think on your points, Karim, they're exactly right. I mean, the only other point I would add, though, is look, across the region, Trump's rhetoric, I think, was roundly applauded.
Yeah.
And this is a region that, has long held up concerns about U.S. double standards and hypocrisy. And frankly, in the shadow of Gaza, efforts to nation build and preach democracy and human rights really are going to ring even more hollow. So I think there's a certain degree of humility that has to be engaged. I was really struck, Amr, by your comments, and it made me think, this is not my area of expertise, and you've done clearly quite a lot of work on this, and it sounds very compelling. And I think the questions really are what you pointed to, how to bring in the non-Arab elements, Turkey, Israel, Iran, who will be critical, right, to some sort of ultimate move toward a regional security architecture. The Middle East, not surprisingly, I think is the only region in the world that's lacked something significant like this. And as you were speaking and you were talking about maybe smaller groupings, I think this is sort of where you were tending, or what came into my mind is the idea of minilaterals. Smaller groupings that can be used to address particular regions or sub-regions where there are challenges and issues, with the understanding, though, that those minilaterals aren't weaponized to score points or undermine or sabotage those who aren't in the minilateral. So if they're really genuinely attempts to solve problems in a more defined and limited way, understanding the limits of what can be done, I think that might be a really interesting approach to start with.
Interesting. Fred?
Yeah, I'd actually written down minilaterals. But no, just to echo what was said, I do think the Arab League and the GCC, look, we've tried to make these institutions into something they're not, and the problem has always been they're exclusionary, they're often perceived as vehicles for one state to project influence. The GCC, the U.S. has been trying to deal with the GCC as a security collective, but the individual members prefer to have their dealings directly with the U.S., so this is not worked out. And I do think the path forward is to, use these platforms as the basis for expanding and then also breaking off into more manageable problems, working groups, and things like freedom of navigation or climate change, things that all the parties can agree upon, where we're looking incrementally at confidence building measures. I do think one example of both regionalizing and internationalizing security is the I2U2 group, which includes India, Israel, UAE, and the United States, again, talking about things like food security, energy, public health. And so again, starting small and working up.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, so I'm going to throw this one out to you all, sort of, creative question, which is, we've seen an unprecedented number of black swans or unpredictable change triggers this past year, such as the death of Nasrallah, al-Shara's win against Assad, and the PKK seeking transition. What are you watching for next, and what are these changes adding up to? So I know no one likes to make predictions, but are there some black swans or situations that are on your mind, or things that you think maybe might not be quite as black swan-ish as they seem? You want to start?
Yeah, so I think the reason why I actually did this exercise in researching a foreign affairs essay I wrote last fall, which region of the world has had the most black swans in the last half century, and by far it's the Middle East. If you look at the Iranian Revolution, Saddam's invasion of Kuwait, 9/11, the Arab uprisings, October 7th, and one of the reasons that this region has more black swans than others is that there's a lot of what business people call key man risk, big decisions or big events hinging on one person, right? The Shah of Iran falls, he had terminal cancer, no one knew, and the entire region changed, right? And most other regions are not like that. So what are the black swans that I would worry about? I worry about Jordan more than any other place. I think that just the demographics of Jordan, probably at this point, around 80% of its inhabitants are not ethnic Jordanians, virtually landlocked, very little resources. That is the place that I worry about most, stability in Jordan.
Great. Yeah, Mona.
So is it still a black swan if there are lots of them? I don't
Sure.
know.
Yeah, sure.
But it's funny, Kareem, I literally wrote down Jordan because I thought, I hate these questions. But Jordan is, I would agree with you, a key country to be concerned with, not only for the reasons you laid out, but also for the instability in the West Bank and the ripple effects into Jordan and what all of that means. And maybe could we talk about a white swan too? Like, is there also something positive? And here, I think, could there be, against all odds, movement toward some sort of durable solution on Iran nuclear that actually opens the way for its integration into the region in a way that works for Israel and its security, et cetera? That would be a white swan. So let's put that on the board as well.
I like that. Amr.
The black swan I see is more military adventurism, as we've been seeing in the last 2.5 years almost. I'm extremely concerned about the impacts of more military adventurism coming out of Israel that has manifested itself not only in Gaza or in actions on the ground in the West Bank, but in Syria, in Yemen, and elsewhere. And I'm not only referring to the danger of a military operation against nuclear sites or some sites in Iran. The environment in the region gets extremely complicated by one actor resorting systematically in a sustained fashion to the military tool as the only way of resolving its conflicts. It de-incentivizes collective security arrangements. And to incentivize collective security arrangement, we need some restraints. And here too is an example for where international actors can play a role in de-incentivizing military adventurism. That's the black swan I see.
Great. Thank you. Fred, to you.
Yeah, I think just to follow on that, the return to this sort of era of interventions and what could prompt that. I want to throw something a bit provocative, but the role of technology, AI, and we don't know the full impact of AI on states' calculations. We see them using it for internal security, but in terms of their war-making apparatus and what we saw with Israel's use of AI in Gaza and how that affects states' willingness to go to war if they perceive the costs are lower. And we saw the availability of drones, changed warfare in the region. I mean, who would have thought the Turks would be going into Libya and what they're doing? So how technology can create, lower the risks for states to embark on adventures. And just to reiterate the issue of internal disruptions, internal change, Jordan, I mean, we do have to recognize that the drivers of the Arab Spring are still there in many of these states. And so we shouldn't simply look at this region in terms of capitals and regimes. We have to look at what's going on below the surface. So.
Well, thank you so much. Please join me in thanking all of our fabulous panelists for this session. So, unfortunately, Representative Joe Wilson was supposed to join us, but is not going to be able to. He can't leave the House floor due to an ongoing vote. So we really apologize. We hope to have him back at Carnegie in the coming days. But in the meantime, we do have some snacks in the lobby. I promise it is less hot out there. Please join us out there to mingle with your fellow attendees and enjoy some snacks. Thank you so much again.
Thank you,
Thank
Sarah.
you. Thank you
Thank you,
so much.
Sarah.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you all. Thanks for including me.
Of course, no, it was
It's
great
really
to
nice
have
to